Okay, maybe it's 2 minutes past the hour. Why don't we kick off? So, hi everyone. Welcome to our event with Benedict. For those of you who haven't met me, my name is Toby Coppel. I'm the Mosaic's co-founder and partner. And if you don't know us, we're a leading European early stage venture firm investing from seed to Series A. And I've spent almost my entire career in technology, both in operating and investing roles in Silicon Valley and in Europe. And thrilled to have our venture partner, Benedict Evans, join us today, who's spent the last 20 years analyzing the tech industry. And each year he publishes an annual presentation, and we're excited to unpick some of the core themes together with you today. So in terms of format, we're going to start with a 30-minute presentation. Benedict only has 100 slides, so 30 minutes is plenty of time for that. And you can submit questions as we go along in the Q&A box or contribute to the discussion in the live chat. And thank you to everyone who's submitted questions in advance. We'll try to address as many of those as possible during the Q&A. So with no further ado, over to you, Benedict.
Great. Thanks a lot for that, Toby. I thought I should begin just for anyone who doesn't know me by reading out the ChatGPT biography. Apparently, my journey from a young technology enthusiast to a respected venture capitalist and thought leader is an inspiring story of insight and expertise that offers valuable lessons for those looking to navigate the changing world of technology. So I think that kind of gives us a good sense of precisely how much we should rely on ChatGPT in the future. Obviously, all of that is entirely correct. But I actually made this presentation only partly talking about generative AI. I kind of wanted to kind of step back and think about sort of a spread of different things that are going on. And so I will share my, my screen sharing is disabled. We need to turn that on, Toby. I will share my screen just as soon as we can do that. Okay. Right, there we go. So I kind of split this into three parts. There is firstly a fairly brief conversation about the macro shift that we've had in the last sort of 6 months, basically the end of free money. Secondly, what is going on in the sort of interlocking nexus of advertising, media, retail, e-commerce, Google, Amazon, Apple, Facebook, Microsoft, and everyone else. And then thirdly, so dreams for the future. This time last year, an awful lot of people were talking about Web3 and Metaverse. Now, all of those people are frantically pivoting to talk about generative machine learning or LLMs, depending on what you want to call it. And so I kind of want to dig into each of these in turn. Now, so the first thing to talk about is the end, this what I call the end of free money. I'm not an economist. This is not a macroeconomic presentation, but we are fairly clearly having to think about macro in a way that we haven't had to for the last decade, maybe longer. And as we all know, there was a long period when capital was very cheap, and now it's not cheap. Meanwhile, as we've come out of the pandemic, we had when we went into the pandemic, we had this kind of surge of adoption of technology, and there was a sort of brief moment when people thought this was kind of a permanent change in the growth path, and now we're sort of reverting back to the trend line. And of course, that is a trend line in which we were at 20% penetration of e-commerce, but we're not at 50%. And if we can argue a little bit about the kind of econometrics of this, so if one looks at the dollar value, you can see, well, the denominator's changed a bit, and there's a lot of inflation in that number. But the long and the short of it is we are 3 to 5 years ahead of where we were in 2018 or 19, but we're now carrying on a growth line that we were at before rather than accelerating upwards. And if you look at the spread across a bunch of both US, UK, and a bunch of European markets, you can kind of see sort of a similar thing. So we had this growth of anything between sort of 50 and 100% in the pandemic. And now we're kind of shifting back towards sort of stabilizing at that level. Now, of course, that flows through to things like the ad market. So Google and Alphabet and Meta had basically 20% annual revenue growth for a decade. And then there was a sort of sickening lurch in the last 18 months as that slowed down, or at least kind of paused. And there's a bunch of companies that had pretty exuberant valuations that are returning to reality. There was kind of a brief moment in late 2020 when Zoom's market cap was larger than Exxon, and that didn't seem particularly sensible even at the time, and that's kind of obviously unwinding. Naturally, some of this flows through to venture capital. So we had a surge of investment in venture, especially in growth rounds, but also in more traditional venture as we went through the pandemic, and that's now unwinding. And if we think about the kind of the longer term trend here, again, we had this surge in the last kind of 3 or 4 years that's now sort of slowing down a little bit. For the younger people on the call, incidentally, that blip in the middle is something called the dot-com bubble. You can ask your older colleagues what that was. It looks kind of relatively insignificant today, but of course that was a bubble at a time when there were maybe 100 or 200 million people online, and now there aren't. So this flows through to things like companies that were particularly predicated on the availability of free money. A friend of mine took this picture in London in 2020 and said, this looks like a moment. And I thought, yeah, I'll save that. That's going to be useful. That moment has gone. And coming with that, we've had a bunch of layoffs. I think Meta just announced another 11,000 layoffs yesterday. But it is kind of worth putting that into perspective. Meta laid off 11,000 people last November, but they'd already hired 15,000 people just in 2022. And all of these companies increased their headcount massively over the period from 2010 to 2019, 2020, and then again through the pandemic. And relative to that, the layoffs that we've had are actually still pretty small, not that they're obviously not painful for anyone that's involved. The missing thing on this chart, incidentally, is is Amazon, which has actually hired 1.25 million people in the last 10 years. And so any layoffs at Amazon in that context are pretty small. So there's a kind of a glass half empty, glass half full point here, I think one could make, which is that on the one hand, we've had overinvestment and loss of discipline in the last couple of years. There's still, I think, an uncertain economic outlook, again, uncertainty in the last 10 days. And kind of stepping back, also a fairly uncertain geopolitical outlook as we have kind of conversations about China. On the other hand, there's 5 billion people with a smartphone now, and every offline habit got broken in the pandemic, and every market and every value chain is being remade around the internet, and just kind of the way it was in 2019. And so I think this is probably the real trend line to think about, that the internet has always been kind of interesting and exciting, but we kind of forget that internet and technology was actually a pretty small industry until pretty recently, and was not actually an important part of most people's lives. Even when Facebook launched in the mid-2000s, there were less than 1 billion people online. Now 5 billion people have got a smartphone. And so this stuff has kind of gone from being interesting and exciting to being just kind of central to every part of how everybody lives. And I think that's the real kind of trend line that shapes what most people on this call are thinking about or building. So then, to talk about, in effect, what was already happening in 2019 and what is still going on today, I want to talk about this idea of gatekeepers. And I think a sort of starting observation is we've always had gatekeepers, and the old gatekeepers are now declining and being replaced. So this is American department stores, which were something like 1/3 of American retail spending, and have now collapsed really since the 1990s, so indeed before the internet, now down to almost nothing. And we see a similar picture on the media side. Newspapers, the original gatekeepers of media, have been declining really since the 1930s, since the emergence of radio advertising, which in fact grew straight through the Great Depression. And they had a kind of an accelerated decline really almost 15 years after the consumer internet started. And in parallel, we have the rise of new companies that we could think of as gatekeepers. So Amazon on a GMV basis is now bigger than Walmart and growing much faster. And advertising has shifted pretty emphatically from old media to new media. So here you can see, as I said, radio actually grew through the Great Depression. Newspapers have been falling ever since. You can also see the growth of TV. And then the decline further print and newspapers, and then TV, and the shift of the market towards the internet, the shift of kind of new models towards the internet. If one kind of broadens that out, globally today, almost all advertising has now shifted to digital, especially in the USA. In China, of course, it was never anywhere else. The UK has shifted as well, and the rest of the world is sort of still somewhere behind, but it kind of the industry, that's $700 or $800 billion, has shifted decisively to this model. And the consequence of that is that if you look at the biggest global media owners, not only is this chart obviously dominated by technology companies, but it's also dominated by global companies. And I think one of the interesting shifts is that it used to be that to be a winner, particularly in media, meant you're a local winner, you're in 1 or 2 countries perhaps. And now, if you've won search or you've won social or you've won one of these categories, then you'll win on a much more global basis, which means you have a much larger dollar number than you might have done in the past. One consequence of that concentration is that the ad spend by the top 100 global advertisers is now roughly equivalent to the ad revenue for Alphabet, Meta, and Amazon. So just those three companies are not just Procter & Gamble, but the 100 biggest global advertisers. So what does that actually mean, though? What do we think about when we talk about gatekeeping or concentration? There are obviously some companies for which this is basically their whole business. So Booking.com and Expedia give 45 to 50% of their top line to Google for search advertising. So that's one place that you can be if you have kind of a commodity product. But there's a more kind of generic or generalized way of thinking about this, I think, which is that anybody who's trying to reach a consumer has two sort of fundamental questions. There's a logistics question and there's a discovery question. Like, how does the customer get your product? How do they physically get it? And then there's a discovery question, which is how do they know you exist? How would they know that they might want to reach you? And there are all sorts of budgets that anyone producing any kind of product might spend in order to solve those problems. And we tend to talk about advertising a lot, but there's a lot of other things that people spend. So there is the ad budget, but there is also retail rent. Rent is another way that you reach customers and talk to customers. There's online advertising, but that's also roughly the same as parcel shipment. And then there's the retailer net income that Procter & Gamble is effectively allowing retailers to have. Then there is search advertising, the money you give to Google, which is interesting coincidence, is roughly the same as the money that retailers give to Visa and MasterCard, which is also roughly the same as the money that they spend on returns. And then there is sales promotion, there's direct mail, and over at the right, there's Amazon ads, which I'll talk a little bit about over at the top. The point here is, I think that, in the past, nobody could have said, should we advertise in that country or just should we open stores in that country or just advertise there? And now those all kind of become one question. Everything below the gross margin line for a brand, for anyone reaching consumers, is now kind of all one question. Where should you allocate that spending? And so if you look at some of these, advertising in the US and the UK as a share of GDP is much higher than it is in some other markets. There's no law of nature that it says that it has to be 1.25% and shouldn't be 2% or 1% or 0.5% if that money gets allocated somewhere else. There's also no law of nature that says that the amount of retail space we have today is the right amount. This is particularly dramatic, I think, if you look at the USA, which has massively more retail square foot per capita than anywhere else in the world, and has in fact massively overbuilt in the last 20 years or so. So if we look here, this shows you capex on retail, construction capex on space in the USA back since the 1970s. And so you see historically, retail and food service was high. That's now come down by 2/3 and has been passed by warehouse spending, which is basically e-commerce fulfillment, which has increased again by about the same ratio, by about three times in the last couple of years, really since 2010. You can see this, of course, in Amazon more than anything else, which more than doubled its warehouse space since 2019 and is now kind of frantically slowing down and pulling back as it kind of, this wonderful phrase, got ahead of its skis a little bit in the pandemic. But I think it's also interesting to go back to that point about these merging of categories and look at Amazon advertising. So Amazon had this line in the back of their accounts called Other, which they said was predominantly ads. And at the end of 2021, they had to break it out, and it turned out it was all ads. And Amazon did $38 billion of advertising revenue in 2022. That is more than Amazon Prime, past Amazon Prime in the course of 2022. It is also, just for comedy value, larger than the global newspaper industry, which of course has been in free fall for the last 10 or 15 years. So yes, Amazon is making more ad revenue than the entire global newspaper industry. But if you kind of dig into that and think, well, what does that mean? Well, Amazon doesn't disclose the operating profit or the capex for the ads business. You can kind of make some fairly reasonable assumptions. This is a much higher margin business than AWS. And so it looks like Amazon is probably producing roughly the same operating income from the ad business as it is from AWS, with probably pretty marginal capex. And so this is producing more profitable than AWS. It's actually producing more operating profit than the whole of the rest of Amazon. And there's a kind of a general point here, which is this quote from the CEO of Walmart, that this is a relatively small business on a revenue, incremental business on a revenue basis, but from a profitability basis, it looks very different. So Walmart now is saying, wow, look at that margin structure. It doesn't, nothing else we do has that margin structure. And so there is at the moment kind of a gold rush into what people call retail media. So Walmart did $2.7 billion in advertising last year. Uber is at a $500 million run rate. And this is all driven firstly by the realization that if you are a retailer with a web, that if you have a website, any website can be ad inventory in a way that retail space, physical retail space isn't. Secondly, by the shift to privacy and the away from cookies, which means that you, as a retailer, you have first-party data, which means you can do targeting that maybe you hadn't realized before. And of course, that margin structure that I talked about on the previous slide. Consequence of this is that Group M reckons that merchant media, retail media, might have been 10% of total US advertising revenue last year. So kind of a completely new space. Found money kind of hiding in plain sight, that's shifting very rapidly into a whole bunch of people that didn't think they were media companies or advertising companies at all. You can also kind of step back and say, well, what is its business? You know, is this advertising or is it marketing? Is this different from, how is this different from end caps? How is this different from sales promotion? You could also ask, is this sales, is this price discrimination? Is this a way for Amazon to get more profitable brands, to give them a larger margin to be on the store? And in a sense, it's kind of all of those. Is it advertising? Is it marketing? Is it end cap? Is it trade dollars? Is it a slotting fee? Well, yes, it's all of those things. What else is going on within Amazon? Well, one of the things I think is less well appreciated is how much of Amazon business in particular is Chinese vendors going direct. So something like 30 to 40, maybe even 50% of Amazon marketplace is actually Chinese vendors who are using it as a way to go around their traditional brand partners and retail partners and go direct to consumers. A great example of this is Anker, which many of you may have bought a battery or a phone charger from. Anker is now a $2 billion business, and they built that entirely on Amazon Marketplace, plus a giant advertising business, going completely direct and bypassing all the traditional channels and the traditional brands that you might have used in order to do that. But if you're unbundling traditional brands and traditional retailers, there's other ways you can do this. Shopify did $200 billion of GMV last year, which is about 45% of the size of Amazon Marketplace. So Shopify is people unbundling Amazon and going direct through to the consumer. And then take that one step further. This is Google Trends for Shein, which is a Chinese smartphone-only fast fashion brand. Shein has overtaken Zara and H&M in Google Trends data. And if you look at the revenue, which has just recently become available, well, Shein has overtaken H&M. It's on track to overtake Inditex. Just at the Zara brand, it's already overtaken the Zara brand. And so it's used a new bundle and a new channel and a new way of thinking about fast fashion in order to build a completely new global business. And so there's kind of an internet question and a software question here. That Zara does 20 to 25,000 new products a year, and it has 2,000 stores. Shein does 5 to 10,000 new products a day and has no stores and a giant ad budget. And so it has a short run on demand production model. It goes direct to consumer. It doesn't have to build stores. It goes to market in a completely different way. And if you don't have to put inventory in 2,000 stores, then you can think very differently about what your product range looks like and how that turns over. Now, I think it's kind of interesting to do a direct comparison of that with what's happened in the grocery business in the last half century, which is basically UPCs, barcodes, and computers meant that grocery stores, supermarkets could have 10 times more product. Like, if you can go around scanning products with a barcode, you don't need to keep records on paper and pencil. You can order products from your brand partners from the Procter & Gamble or Unilever every day instead of every month. And so the inventory in the typical supermarket went from about 5,000 products to over 50,000 products before pulling back a little bit. That's computers changing growth, the last generation of computers changing groceries. And now another direct comparison with inventory is to look at the TV business, where the emergence of new channels, first cable and then streaming, meant that, again, you had massively more inventory and you could run massively more inventory, so you have way more SKUs. And I don't think anybody in the TV business would appreciate me calling a television show a SKU, but that's kind of what it is. And what you can see here is that Netflix is now making more SKUs, more TV shows than the entire TV business back in 2006 when Netflix first got into streaming. Now, one consequence of this, of course, is back to my discovery question. This is the rating for the top rated show every year back since 1950. And course, what's happening here is the more TV there is, the less we will watch the same stuff and the harder it is to know what to watch. But of course, what's also happening is that the traditional TV companies themselves are being unbundled. So here you can see first the adoption of TV, and then the growth of cable, pay TV in the middle, and then the growth of streaming and the collapse of cable, which is now down by at least a third from the peak, maybe a half from the peak. And with that, of course, as we all know, the decline in viewing, where again, linear TV viewing is also down by about a third since 2015. It's interesting kind of to go, I think, sort of just to step aside and look at Netflix and say, well, what is it that this is really doing? So I thought it would be kind of fun to look at Netflix revenue versus video rental revenue. So we can see Netflix in the US is basically roughly the same size that the US video rental business was. So is that what it's done? Is that what it's replaced? What's the addressable market here exactly? Now, if we go back and look at what Netflix is doing, I think it's very clear that Netflix is a TV company. All the questions that matter for Netflix are TV questions. And of course, the primary question that matters is, what are you spending to buy TV shows? There's no network effects here. There's no software here. It's about buying TV shows. And so Netflix is now spending as much as any of the legacy content producers, the legacy content manufacturers, whether that's Paramount or NBC or Warner. It's kind of got into that same segment. And what matters here is the TV shows. It's not software. Now, there was a moment when people in Silicon Valley would say, oh, legacy media companies will never be able to make software. Well, it turned out that you can make software that's good enough, and what matters is the TV. And so Disney's software is maybe not quite as good as Netflix, but that doesn't really matter. What matters is the TV shows. So Disney now has roughly as many subscribers globally as Netflix does. Of course, getting to that is expensive. So Disney has been burning enormous amounts of capital, like over $1 billion in the last each of the last 4 quarters on customer acquisition and on running that business, which of course is why the TV industry was so hesitant to do this. But again, this is a TV question. This is not a software question. And if I go back and look at this chart then again, so here we have the legacy TV companies and Netflix, which, as I suggested, is basically a TV company as well. But there's something missing, I think, which is YouTube, which I think is not necessarily a TV company, or is a very different kind of TV company. And YouTube, if you look at the creator payouts, is spending roughly the same as those legacy TV companies, roughly the same as Netflix, but it's doing it in a very different way. And so when Netflix goes to LA and buys LA stuff from LA people, YouTube is not doing that. YouTube is doing something different. YouTube is producing roughly the same viewing as Netflix, and this is just TV viewing. So if you were to look at smartphones and PCs, you get a much higher number. And if you look at what's going on within that, though, what is it that YouTube is doing? Well, I thought it was kind of interesting to make some sort of back of the envelope guesses as to what Mr. Beast is relative to a Netflix show. And you can get kind of enough numbers to say that Mr. Beast is probably getting equivalent viewing of his content to a top 5, maybe even a top Netflix show, based on which estimates you produce. And so this is basically and he's not trying to get a TV show. You know, his ambition is not to get a production deal in Hollywood. He's building his own business and doing that with a completely different kind of channel. And I think that's actually a much bigger change in the nature of television than Netflix is. Now, of course, the other side of this is TikTok. And it always kind of puzzles me when people say that TikTok competes with Instagram. As far as I'm saying, this chart is showing TikTok as teenagers' favorite social network. I'm not sure that TikTok really competes with Instagram. I think TikTok competes with YouTube. I think what TikTok is doing, again, is poking away at that question of video and entertainment and how that works in a way that YouTube does, again, rather more perhaps than Netflix does. Now, kind of classic quote from my old boss, Mark Andreessen, software is eating the world. Let's kind of unpick some of what I've just been talking about. Some of what's happened on the internet in the last 20 years, particularly what happened in the first 10 years, was information arbitrage. This is what Yelp does, what TripAdvisor does, what Expedia does. It provides tickets, reviews, listings, booking services, but it's information around the edge of the internet, around the edge of existing industries. Then, and this is really what Mark was talking about, there's software that actually changes what the product is. You know, Uber does not sell software to taxi companies. Airbnb is not a hotel company. It's changing what a hotel is. And of course, this is the endless argument over Tesla. Is Tesla really changing what it is to be a car or not? But most of what I've just been talking about in the last 5 or 10 minutes is actually not necessarily changing the product very much. It's where software is a new channel. That YouTube is changing the product, but Netflix and Shein are not really changing the nature of TV or the nature of clothes or the nature of retailing. They're just using the internet as a new channel in order to break in with a new model and take share from people in a different way. And so, in fact, perhaps I think a more useful again, very kind of much overused quote here is the line from Jim Barksdale that there's two ways to make money. You can bundle or you can unbundle. And of course, what's happening now is people are breaking up the old bundles and working out what new bundles might look like. Hence, I've talked about Shein and Shopify and Netflix. It's also worth looking at an old economy company, Nike, which has shifted its model from going to wholesale to going direct. Nike has unbundled a traditional physical retail model and built its own physical retail and its own online stores, decided not to be on Amazon, decided to go direct, and is changed its opinion of what the right bundle should look like. And so if I can kind of go up to a higher level of abstraction here, there's a kind of a classic model for a big brand over the last 100 years, which is all about scale and efficiency and optimization, manufacturing scale, logistics scale, physical distribution and marketing scale. It's all about who can do a nationwide TV buy, who can put product in stores across the country, who can buy the back page of Vogue. And what's happening, I think, is that all of those parts of that brand bundle, that way that you would go to market, get broken apart. And you could apply this to CPG. You could also apply this to to Wise, or you could apply this to Shopify, or you could apply this to any of the D2C brands, that you break apart that presumption that this is the only way you can build a brand, or this is the best way you can build a brand, and that every part of that value chain gets broken apart. And so, of course, I called this section Old and New Gatekeepers, but it's kind of worth thinking, well, what are we talking about when we talk about a gatekeeper? You know, what are the old gatekeepers? Well, they really were gatekeepers. Sears stocked 200,000 items. There were maybe 2,000 TV shows made in the USA even last year, and most newspapers in the US were local monopolies. Even in Europe, you know, there's 3, 4, 5 newspapers. We've shifted to a model in which we have a very different kind of gatekeeper that does an awful lot less gatekeeping, in which there is massively more product, massively more opportunity, and massively more choice, both for entrepreneurs and for retailers and consumers. And so what I really think we're kind of looking at here is it's been a sort of a fundamental reset in the nature of the market, that we now have effectively, that there used to be filters on how you could find out about a product, filters on what product there could be, on what retail space there was, on how much media space there was, on who could talk to a consumer. And now we have effectively infinite product, effectively infinite media. We don't have those filters. And so we have a blank canvas for creating new kinds of business in this sort of market, sort of infinite product, in infinite media, infinite possibility, infinite choice. And of course, infinite choice is a problem as much as it's a bad thing, as much as a good thing. And so just kind of wrap up this and then to talk about generative machine learning, which I know is the only reason any of you are actually on this call. I love this quote from Jeff Bezos from 2009, advertising is the price you pay for having an unremarkable product or service. Last year, 2021, Amazon was in fact the largest advertiser on earth. So obviously Jeff changed his mind. But of course, what this reflects is that underlying question, like how is it the customer knows about you? How do you talk to people? And what do you talk about? How do you go and reach them? And hence, you know, the even older joke that rent is the new CAC, advertising is the new rent. All of those things merge into one. Amazon doesn't have many stores yet, but they have a very big advertising budget. So with that, I will talk about what happens next. And framing that I used in the presentation that I gave last year is that there were these kind of separate, there's a sort of an uneven distribution of the future, in that most of the ideas most of the ideas I've just been talking about are really ideas from sort of 2000 or 2010. They're ideas like maybe people will buy stuff on the internet, or maybe people will watch TV on the internet. And those are ideas that are taking 5, 10, 15, 20 years to work their way through the economy. Meanwhile, what most actual startups are doing today is deploying ideas from 2000, 2010, 2015, even 2010, 2015. Ideas like SaaS and cloud and machine learning and workflow and automation. Most startups today, you know, particularly most enterprise startups, are building ideas that are well understood, that people have been creating over the last decade, and finding some new place that you can deploy them. And then meanwhile, all the noise out of Silicon Valley is, what are we going to do in 10 years' time? What's the next fundamental platform shift? What is the really cool, sexy, exciting stuff happening now that everybody will be doing in a decade? So just touching on some of those points briefly, this is a great chart that Goldman Sachs do of where are we in cloud adoption. And the story is basically that for the last 5 or 6 years, enterprise cloud adoption has been at sort of 20 to 25%, while CIOs say, yes, but in 3 years' time, I'm going to be at 40 or 50% and somehow never quite get there. And I think the message of this chart is, if you're in tech, then cloud is like an old and boring story and it's done. But actually, there's an enormous amount more deployment to be done in cloud, to be done in machine learning, to be done in all the stuff that we've been talking about for the last 10 years. Meanwhile, what is the future? Well, last year we would have said metaverse and Web3, and maybe Web3 and metaverse, and also metaverse and Web3. It's kind of difficult not to have a conversation without talking about metaverse and Web3. Did I say metaverse enough now? And I think the narrative on each of those has changed. I think particularly metaverse suffered from a sort of bullshit explosion in that it just got used to mean absolutely anything. And now we're all kind of wondering if Apple's going to launch something this summer, and if not, what. Meanwhile, a lot of people have been saying that crypto and Web3 are kind of the next way to build software companies. I don't think that's actually changed. It's just we are not going to be able to build Instagram on a blockchain this summer. It's going to take a bit longer to build infrastructure and plumbing. Meanwhile, I think I'd also suggest that this time last year, LLMs and GPT were this kind of interesting science project, but we kind of understood AI and it was done and it worked and it was kind of boring and it was a new sequel. And now, in the last sort of 6 months, even 3 months, this is now absolutely everything that anybody can think about and talk about. And so we've had a kind of a pullback of enthusiasm in Web3 and in crypto, and particularly after the kind of ridiculous bubble that we had in NFTs this time last year. And people have been kind of looking at Meta's operating budget for VR and saying, this is a very long way away from being a mass market product and costing an extraordinary amount of money. Is this really where we should be focused? And I think one should sort of step back and say, well, yes, but nothing's really changed. If you believed in blockchain this time last year, nothing's really changed to say that that was wrong. If you believed in VR and AR, again, nothing's necessarily changed. The questions are all kind of the same. And you kind of have to understand that the future can take a long time. It took kind of 10 years of talking about mobile internet for it to actually happen. And this is going to take 10 years as well. But meanwhile, there's something else that's happened, as I think we probably all know. And I think kind of a useful way to think about this is to go back and look at the ImageNet moment in kind of 2013, where we said, okay, here is image recognition with neural networks. Okay, that's kind of clever. You show it to people and say, okay, you can recognize a bird and a frog. Like, why do I care about this? And of course, what's happened since then is that this spread from a cool image recognition demo to more or less everything in tech. And we realized that you could generalize this much more broadly than just recognizing cat pictures. The same thing now, I think, with generative networks. This, again, is a demo from 2014. And you show this to people and they go, okay, that looks kind of interesting, but so what? And of course, now we kind of go, oh, okay, that's very cool. But so what do we do with this? You can do cool demos. You can do interesting experiments. How does this generalize? What do we turn this into? What's the right level of abstraction for understanding this? How does this generalize in particular beyond automated text and automated pictures? What else is this for? Is this just text and pictures? What else? What can you turn into automated text and pictures? And so is this generative search? Is it you search for something and you get back what you asked for, even if it didn't already exist before? How much can we use this for design, for creating products, for helping people create code? How much can we use for actually creating consumer products? So one of these images is a product shot from Shein. 3 of them are created by Stable Diffusion based on that image. What happens if you go to Shein and search for product and a generative network creates the product? What would that look like? And so I think as we sort of sit and look at all of this stuff, and of course, there's a question of how much Moore's law it's going to need and how much computers it's going to cost. And so I think as we kind of sit and look at all of this stuff, we think, well, okay, this is probably a second wave of machine learning. It's at least as big as the last wave, if not substantially bigger. Does this take us to AGI? Well, Sam Altman thinks so. Most other people in AI don't think so. But this is certainly changing how we create software and what software we're actually going to build with that. So with that, I think I will skip my kind of concluding slides and just kind of pause for breath and say, what did I forget to talk about?
Thanks, Benedict. So I'd love to ask the audience if they have questions to post them in the Q&A. And we've got some questions that we've received in advance. So maybe Benedict, I know that your prediction was that the only things people would want to talk about would be generative AI, and that is certainly majority of the questions. But maybe start with one question from Christian Lindholm, who was asking about the user interface of chatbots, and today that they generate a huge amount of text. And his question is, have you seen any interesting new AI-based UXs that sort of fit into a much more limited space, perhaps mobile oriented?
Yeah, I think it's interesting to compare this with voice assistants like 5 years ago, where like one problem with voice assistants is they can understand what you're asking, but they can actually only give you one of the 50 answers that they've already built. So like you can ask it cricket scores, but it could only give you cricket scores if someone at Amazon has built a cricket score thing. And LLMs sort of in principle solve that, except of course that they might be hallucinating and give you scores that they've made up for a match that didn't happen. But the other problem with voice assistants is the bandwidth, that like actually audio is not necessarily the right UI for an awful lot of the things that you might want to do. You know, I mean, if you want to say like what are flight options for going between Warsaw and Amsterdam next Thursday, you don't really want to hear somebody read out a list of flights. You kind of want to see it on the screen. And I think you can kind of generalize this to chatbots as well. Like I'm not at all sure that a chatbot is the right UI for some of this stuff. I mean, particularly as I look at something like Midjourney, I don't think of what chatbot is the right UI, or maybe it is. Maybe the right UI is, but I can ask it questions and say, make this more that, or make more that. But also like having to like stuff the prompt with 300 terms in order to get the image that I want also doesn't necessarily seem like the right UI. It does feel a bit kind of command liney, that you're supposed to know exactly. I mean, and it's for Paradox, it's supposed to be natural language, but it's not natural language. You have to know, you have to ask exactly what you want in exactly the right way. Even though you can ask in prose, you still have to know what prose. And I certainly think like a lot of the products here are going to generalize beyond text in the way that, you know, machine learning kind of generalized beyond just image recognition. And so, you know, you're already sort of seeing this in the stuff that Microsoft and Google have announced this week, where they're not you doing it as a chatbot in the same way. And so I think that's just kind of that's not necessarily the right UI. There's lots of other ways that you can sort of surface that underlying capability. But again, it's you know, you know, if you try and kind of keep track of like what are all the new generative AI things, there's like 50 every fucking day. So like, yes, but I'm sure there are, but like, I don't know. I haven't seen one yet.
Read Ben Tossel's newsletter, you'll get lots of ideas.
Yeah, there's like 20 of them every day. Yeah. And there's a point that one could kind of make here, which is like, I mean, as I was saying to Toby the other day, yesterday, that like a lot of the the hypothesis, a lot of the creative energy in crypto was there was no stack. It was completely open. So you could create SMTP, you could create FTP, you could invent SSL. And so that's really exciting to a certain kind of engineer. Whereas where we are with generative machine learning is like the whole stack is already there. So you can make anything, like you and you can actually make like consumer products and press go and it's right there. So it's a kind of it's the same volume of creative energy, but kind of for a different reason.
Great. So a couple of other questions on generative AI. One broader question from James Calvert was about, you know, I think most of us feel that generative AI is going to change the entire way that we work or buy or play. We probably can't grasp it, but what advice would you have for incumbents in either retail or tech sort of looking into the abyss, how to deal with it, what questions they should be asking?
So I think there's two ways to answer this. I think the first is to kind of play back what happened with the last wave of machine learning. And so there's sort of three levels of abstraction. So there's image recognition, and that becomes a primitive on AWS and Azure and GCP. And then there is like, we're going to use sentiment analysis to build a completely new kind of intrusion detection for network security. So you're building like a very specific vertical application, as opposed to it just being like pattern recognition. Or, you know, we're going to use image recognition to tell you whether your warehouse is flooded. So it's a very specific vertical application. And then the third case is it just becomes a feature inside existing products, or you may not even know that it's there. So, I mean, the example I always give is at A16Z, we invested in a company that does legal discovery software. And so now they can do translation and they can do sentiment analysis. So you can say, find me all the angry emails, or you can say, find me other emails that look like this. And they're not really an AI company, they're a legal discovery company. And, you know, a lot of what they are about is how do you turn this into product and how do you take it to market? How do you understand the right way of selling software to law firms? And by default, I would presume that most of this will kind of run in the same way, that there will be those different levels of abstraction. There will be like the basic building blocks, and there'll be the new vertical companies, and there'll be the places where it just gets absorbed into existing vertical product. I think the other way of looking at this would be, if we kind of think about what happened when we went from like adding machines to mainframes, and from mainframes to PCs, and from PCs to the web. There's a sort of step one, which is you use the new thing to do what you were doing with the old thing. So, you know, you print out your emails. Remember when every email said, please don't print this? And, you know, it was really important that you would make your memos. You'd use Word to make really carefully formatted memos. And then but then you're emailing them. And at a certain point now, you know, now your emails are one line. You say, yes, thanks. You don't have to say, dear sir, thank you very much for your email of this date. Now you just send a fucking email. And I think the same, we kind of go through that same process with this. Like there's a step one, which is Google and Facebook, and sorry, Google and Microsoft add a thing to PowerPoint to make the slides for you automatically. To me, like that, like, no, the question is, why have you got slides? What are the slides doing? And the example I always used to give is like, you've got somebody who pulls data out of SAP into a CSV, puts a CSV in Excel, makes charts, puts the charts into PowerPoint, emails them to everybody. And one person says, hey, just give the CSV to an LLM and it'll make the charts for you. And the other person says, no, there should be a SaaS dashboard. Why the fuck are you sending a PowerPoint file around? It's like the solution, you don't like make it Google Slides instead of PowerPoint so that everybody's got the updated version. Why is it slides? What is it you're trying to do here? And I think that's the evolution that you have with each of these generational shifts. And that's, you know, that's kind of what we've seen with machine learning. And I think that's what we'll see with this as well. That like step one is make it a feature of the existing stuff. And step two is like make new stuff that you couldn't have done without that.
Great. Another related question we've had a few times, you and I have chatted about is, what's all this hullabaloo about Google search, and does chatbot and ChatGPT undermine their business model and replace search, and how, you know, what's the implication for Google?
Yeah. So I have like I've got like a draft post about this. I think like unpicking this several different ways. So firstly, Google has always had this progression of stuff that just gives you 10 blue links and stuff where they try and give you an answer. And clearly LLMs mean that there will be way more categories where they can just give you an answer. And there will be stuff that you didn't realize you just wanted an answer that you do. So like, you know, you're going to Barcelona next week. You Google a bunch of hotels, you Google restaurants, you Google tourist stuff, you Google like what are cool things to do. And now you just say to an LLM, like, make me an itinerary for 4 days, and it gives it to you. And so there'll be stuff where you didn't really think you would do it, that was a problem that you had, and it will turn into an LLM use case. So you didn't realize it was an LLM use case. So clearly some portion of search will turn into that. The question is like, well, A, how much? B, how much? How does that map against stuff where there was an ad? And you know, if you went to Google and said, what's the time in Germany? That wasn't really an ad-based thing anyway. If you go to Google and say, make me an itinerary, including some suggestions for hotels and restaurants, that can have ads, even if it's not linked. You know, that's still a purchasing decision that can still have ads, but there'll be different ads, priced differently, sold differently, measured differently. So there's a real kind of disruption just in like, what are the teams? And you can fuck it up, you can drop the ball as you go through that transition. I think the third observation is like, there's no good reason why Google won't do this as well as Microsoft, just like it's a sort of throwaway point, except that like they might struggle with that business transition, with the politics of it. They won't struggle with the tech of it. I think another answer though is, you know, if I ask Google if I have appendicitis, I don't think that would be a good idea. If I ask Google, do I have appendicitis, I'm going to get links to hospital websites that tell me. If I ask ChatGPT, do I have appendicitis, it will tell me something that might be true. And if I hit reload, I might get something completely different. I mean, any of you who are sort of who've done enough on the internet that you can be Google, oh, well, just a simple test. Go ask ChatGPT about me. And actually, I spoke in an event 2 weeks ago, and the event organizer did this to write a bio. And it's a great bio until you hit reload and you get a completely different bio. So apparently I went to Oxford, now I went to Cambridge, now I went to Bristol, now I went to LSE. My first job was at Bain, McKinsey, Morgan Stanley, SBC Warburg. I joined Mosaic in 2015, 2020. No, I founded it in 2010. And like, it's all plausible, but it's bullshit. Except for founding Mosaic, obviously, which is Toby and Simon don't know about. And so there's a kind of, and there's two questions, I suppose there's two strands to that, which is firstly, does the model get better to the point that it doesn't matter? Like, does it get to like 99.99% accuracy and you stop worrying about it? And secondly, how much does the product, maybe actually three questions. Secondly, how much does the product communicate the degree of uncertainty? Because if you Google something, you don't just presume the first result is right. It gives you 10 links and it kind of says, we're not sure about these. And at this stage, only an idiot just presumes the first link must be correct. You know, you kind of look at it and you assess it. And whereas ChatGPT just kind of tells you this is the answer. And so I think that's a product problem rather than a technology or an science problem. I think the third issue is that there's a sort of a 2x2 matrix of can you recognize the mistake? Does the mistake matter? And so I was just sort of, I think it's really interesting to play with like Midjourney or Stable Diffusion here. So like this morning I went to Midjourney and I said, give me a picture of a Roman galley at sea in a storm. And what I get back is, okay, number one, that's not a Roman galley. It looks a bit like a Viking longship, which I suppose is technically a galley, but it's not a Roman galley at all. Do you know that? If you don't know that, you may yes or no. Secondly, sailor replied, tweeted this, a guy replies to me saying, I'm a sailor, those waves are all fucked up. And why is the wind pushing this way, but the sail is pushing that way? And I'm sure if you're a meteorologist, you look at the clouds and you go, that's not a fucking storm. And if you're a geologist, you look at the cliffs and go, those cliffs are completely screwed up. But the question is, well, does it matter? Can you tell, does it matter? So if you're the editor of The Economist and you just want a picture of a ship in a storm at sea and to put on the cover, you don't care. If you've asked, do I have appendicitis because you've got a stomach ache? A, you can't tell the difference, and B, it really matters. All of which is like a really long way of saying, like, I don't think you can use it for search. You know, if you're in Salesforce and you say, write me a really good sales email, you're a salesperson, you could read the email and you can tell. But if you're using it for general search, then you don't know what the right answer is, and it matters. And so this is, I think, is a great thing where Microsoft has this brand Copilot. That like I often describe machine learning as like giving you infinite interns. So listen to all the customer calls and tell me if the customer's angry. Like an intern could do that. Well, this gives you an intern and you can say, make me a bio of everybody who's speaking at our conference. Yeah, then you've got to go and check it. Like you wouldn't just let the intern do that and not check. But it's still a lot easier than doing it yourself. So I think that's sort of the way that I'm kind of trying to triangulate in on like what is the answer here. That it's really, really useful as long as you can check, as long as you will recognize where it's wrong. And in web search, it's not. You can't. So I don't think you can use it for web search. Or you've got to wrap like loads of product around it to solve for all those use cases.
Thank you, Benedict. Another related question.
That was like a whole other question. Like, can you use this for search? Well, like, there's not a short answer to that. Sorry.
We've spent hours on that, and I'm sure we could spend many more discussing it. One question we talk about a lot at Mosaic is sort of the battle of the LLMs, OpenAI, Google, Anthropic, Cohere, etc. Lots of open source ones. Do you think that startups can build on these LLMs and build something defensible? If everyone's using ultimately the same models, will the products be different? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the answer to this is exactly the same as it would have been 3 or 4 years ago about machine learning. Like maybe not, but like the default position has to be that. Can you build on can you build, should you build your own image recognition tool, or should you just use the AWS one? Well, it kind of depends, like how specific is your data. Can you compete with Google at building a general purpose image recognizer? Of course not, don't be silly. Am I building an image recognizer to look for flaws in the castings of large industrial products? Yeah, you should probably build your own image set and build your own recognizer. or something. And so I think that would be the same answer here. Like, again, it's back to my point about like, where are you in the stack? If you are a legal software company and you want to add translation as a feature, you should not go out and build your own English to German translation engine. Except maybe legal terminology matters. And so there maybe then for legal terminology you do, but if you're just like translating emails, then you don't, you'd use Azure. And I think the answer, all of those, it depends kind of questions that we've had for machine learning. The last wave of machine learning probably apply to this one as well.
Thank you. Great one. So maybe one other question from the audience is, beyond sort of AI, if you can possibly think beyond AI, because I know it's consuming all of your time and our time right now, are there any important other generational tech shifts that you see out there, or we kind of covered most of them in your presentation?
Well, so this time last year, I kind of I had a slide which I didn't include in this deck, which was basically conversations about the future. On the one side, Web3 and metaverse. On the other side, a long list of more vertical, more specific technologies. So LEO satellites, quantum, plant-based meat, the collapsing cost of solar, 3D printing, AI, which then was not on anyone's holy fucking shit list. Now, of course, it's the only thing on that list. And there's a lot of like frontier technology that will be really important for certain things. Less obvious that there's things there that are going to be like transformative at a general level in the way that generative machine learning is. Quantum, I listen to descriptions of quantum, and the phrase is, it's all Greek to me. As far as I can tell, this is sort of very important for some very specific things, but not like transformative to the whole industry. But there's also, there's other stuff going on. So, there is, decoupling from China. What does that mean? There is sort of the end of Moore's law and the shift in how the chip industry works. What does that mean? There is a shift to edge computing, and a big part of the generative machine learning conversation seems to me is, how long do these models stay in the cloud and expensive, and how quickly do they go onto your smartphone and become cheap? And what does that mean? So there's a lot of kind of questions around generative machine learning and around kind of structural shifts in the industry. There aren't things that I think are like new platforms in the way that people talked about. People talk about VR and AR and Web3, and also now about ML. Apple might announce their glasses this summer. They might be a big deal. If they are, it will take 3 years the way it took for the watch and the iPad and the phone. Or they might not. Apple has been going to announce glasses this summer for the last 5 years. So we'll see.
Right. And a few other questions that came from different places around venture capital and what's the future of VC? Do you think that AI can be disrupted by it? I was pitched by another company today who told me I was going to be out of a job very soon and I should just invest in them. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, we had that about crypto as well. Remember, like distributed means there'll be no VCs anymore. Yeah, look, if we have AGI, then nobody on this call will have a job. Absent that, no, I think judgment and expertise and human interaction and so on will still be worth something and still mean something. Obviously, it's going to be a lot easier to write your rejection emails. There is kind of a joke about you've got like one person uses an LLM to turn 3 bullet points into a 20-slide deck, and they send it to somebody, and the recipient uses an LLM to turn it into 3 bullet points. This is kind of like the new CSV, I think, gets turned into. And so yeah, there'll be some of that going on, but I don't see like absent general like general AI, which most people don't think is this actually takes us very close to. I'm not sure there's a sort of structural challenge to like the way the economy works or way capital allocation works.
Okay, well, I was with Sam Altman last week and he was convinced it was coming in the next 5 to 7 years. So it's getting closer. And we have our portfolio company, Inflection, Mustafa Suleiman, the DeepMind founder, who's building a specific type of AGI, which is very exciting. We'll have to test it out.
Yeah, there's a whole like philosophical conversation around what would AGI even mean and what is that? Like, does a dog has general intelligence? AGI does not mean people. most people in machine learning research seem to be on the kind of don't be silly side of this still, frankly. But clearly there's people who aren't. I'm not going to argue about whether Jeff Hinton or Sam Altman are right. You know, it's like, I merely observe that most people who know an awful lot about this are pretty skeptical.
All right, so that means we're going to have a job. I'm relieved. So I think we've got 3 minutes left. Why don't we give it back to everyone to before whatever they have at 5 p.m. UK or 6 p.m. Central. And thank you everyone for joining, and thank you, Benedict, for a great presentation and discussion. Have a great rest of your day, everybody. Bye-bye.